My name is Mickey Nelson, and I will be presenting my capstone. I'll be presenting my research about Asian elitism, the history, and effects on Chinese overseas. What is Asian elitism? Asian elitism is a hierarchy within the Asian community that creates a divide which separates the Asians in their homeland from the Asians specifically in Europe or the United States. This is focusing on elitism between Asians from their home countries to Asian Americans. Specifically, the group that it affects the most is mainland Chinese and overseas Chinese. Asian elitism in America has created niches, communities, expectations, and ways of life for the Chinese who migrated to America. I have studied Chinese elitism and its effects on Chinese American diaspora between the early 19th and early 20th century, specifically Asian elitism and its effects again on Chinese overseas. The Chinese overseas are people who migrated to the United States or to Europe from China, and mainland Chinese are those who are perpetuating Asian elitism and creating the Chinese elitism. From studying Asian elitism, I have found it is a hierarchy within the Asian community that separates the different categories of people in Asia around the world. Specifically, it separates Chinese in their home countries from Chinese Americans. It has had a major effect on wealth, power, and societies between the Chinese and the Chinese Americans. Through the explanation and understanding of Confucianism and its impacts on the Chinese ideologies, education, and ethnicity of Chinese hierarchies, also the elitist attitude portrayed by the Chinese toward overseas Chinese. Asian elitism in America, again, has created the niches, communities, expectations, and ways of life of those who've migrated to America from China. Specifically, the definition of Asian elitism that I have found is that it's a hierarchy within the Asian community that separates the different categories of people in Asia around the world. It's specifically, again, separating Asians from their home countries from Asian Americans, which is the Chinese overseas who've migrated to the United States or Europe from China, and mainland Chinese who were born and still living in China. Asians living in East Asia look down upon Asians who've migrated to other countries, specifically the United States, because they are not technically fully Asian in their eyes. Now, Asian elitism and Chinese overseas. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Chinese were moving to America due to Asian elitism and opportunity in America, as you can see from the map of the Chinese population per county in 1880. The Chinese diaspora furthered the wedge between mainland Chinese and overseas Chinese. And this was due to long-standing Confucian ideals and the hierarchies in China. Overseas Chinese were coming to America to create their own communities. The Chinese who moved their families to the US or Europe to create more opportunities for themselves, and Americans who are of mixed ethnicities, whether that be Chinese and American or Chinese and European, known as, again, the Chinese diaspora. Chinese diaspora is the mass immigration from the 19th century and 18th century caused by corruption, starvation, war in mainland China, and they moved here also for economic opportunities. These were the people who created the Chinese American societies that are still prevalent in America today, seen on the East Coast and the West Coast. But attitudes of Asian elitism have created separation between these communities of wealth, power, and societies between the Chinese and the Chinese Americans, resulting in divide and discrimination between Asians in their home country and to those anywhere else in the world, particularly those of mixed ethnicity and those who belong to the working class. The Chinese in mainland China were separating themselves from Chinese overseas. Within this research, there have been many links to Confucianism and how elitism was founded and based in the society from the beginning, which has led to the effect it has had on Chinese American communities. Confucianism, education, ethnicity are three major themes that created the history of Asian elitism and its effects on the Chinese overseas. Again, Chinese Americans were coming to the East and West Coast and establishing communities. They were moving to the United States for opportunity and understanding of the social and political hierarchies that were established in China. Chinese Americans have become a key topic of discussion in America. Chinese Americans have received criticism from the Chinese in China and from the other Americans around them. Elitism characterizes the attitudes of Chinese within China and other parts of Asia towards Chinese immigrants. Now, Confucianism, perpetuating Asian elitism. You may ask, how did Confucianism and its ideals create Asian elitism? Well, the Confucian democracy, which has also based in morals, ideals, and values of Confucianism, has created and perpetuated Asian elitism. Since the practice of Confucianism, elites in China use Confucianism to propel themselves to the top of socioeconomic status and social status. Confucianism and Chinese society explain the culture and expectations. Confucianism is a system of philosophical and ethical teachings that was founded by Confucius. Confucianism is a belief that people are all fundamentally good, teachable, improvable through community and self-cultivation. The research of other scholars makes it evident that Confucianism and elitism are most prevalent in politics and education in the Chinese history and present day, which has established a wedge between Chinese in China and overseas Chinese. Politics and education are truly the main ways Asian elitism creates a divide for Chinese overseas. Researcher Sor Hon Tun has found that elitism as a political philosophy asserts that those who distinguish themselves by occupation or special knowledge of some other valued ability can make better decisions and should decide for the less able. It attempts to explain or justify elites and their roles in society. End quote. This statement, or written statement, shows that the elitist idea is to stay on top of the hierarchy and make all decisions for people that they believe are not fit to make political decisions in their own communities. Tan's ideas connect to Asian elitism because it shows that elites enforce the hierarchy that elitists have created to keep themselves at the top and to keep the, as they call, uneducated at the bottom. Now, for the second quote. Historically, the rules by elites in China that was associated with Confucianism, or rather Confucian ideology, paid little attention to the values of liberty and equality, and as a consequence was often oppressive. End quote. This point connects to elitism and Confucianism together because it specifically shows how the elites use the ideals to propel themselves forward. They saw themselves as the only fit people in China to create rules and laws for others. They used the Confucian ideal that virtuous and talented people had the responsibility to Confucian ways to create this divide, to create democratic politics. Lastly, the author is also proving the point that elites that use Confucianism is elitist, and it should be functional or meritocratic and now closed in privilege. Now, education. Asian elitism and its effects on Chinese overseas. Since the beginning of Chinese society, education has been an instrument to propel the elite forward and keep the non-educated behind. Education and higher education in China was used to group achieving students from underachieving students in China. Perpetuating that, education was used to separate students and categorize them to separate students who had resources and excelled in the classroom from students who did not have the resources and did not perform well in the classroom. Education is a huge driving force of creating the divide of Asian elitism and perpetuating divide in the socioeconomic statuses between Chinese and Chinese overseas. The research that has been done shows how Confucianism and education have made another divide between the overseas Chinese and the mainland Chinese since China and Confucianism was established. One scholar, James Hankins, writes about both Western and Eastern societies and how Confucianism has impacted Eastern higher education. In his article named Reforming Elites the Confucian Way, he examines the similarities and differences of higher education in China with Confucian ideals and in the United States. He writes about mediocrity and how America's mediocrity is not quite as established in Confucianism as it is in China and the Confucius ways. Meritocracy is defined as either the group of highly skilled people or the government that are picked because of their abilities. He writes that political Confucianism, quote, the name is meant to distinguish it from the new Confucian movement of the early and mid-20th century, an effort of some scholars first inside, then outside to China to modernize Confucianism and bring it into harmony with Western rationalism, end quote. This written statement is showing that by bringing in Confucian ideals and thoughts to Western education, that it would create more harmony in America, which is describing changes with America because by bringing Confucian ideals to America, it would change the American ideals. The Chinese believe that America needs to adopt Confucian ways to become more educated and have more harmonious ways of living. This shows that Confucianism is a way of living and that China uses this because they live in harmony, and they want to show Americans this way to provide a better way of living. Through my own research, I have found that the Chinese want to, in a way, impose a belief system because they think it would best suit America and for the Americans to become more educated, meaning that with Confucian ideas, it could be implemented to help America want to strive for elite education. With this understanding of Confucianism and how it directly links to the Asian elitism, it is now possible to understand the research of Asian elitism and how it has affected the Chinese societies in the United States. Ethnicity, Asian elitism, and the effects on Chinese overseas. The Chinese of mainland saw themselves as pure and identified with being purely Chinese. Overseas Chinese and people who were of mixed race and Chinese who were not seen as pure Chinese. This was their definition. There is also a thing called the Eurasian experience, which also leads into the Chinese national identity, which reinforced pride and exclusion of mixed Chinese people. Ethnicity plays a huge role in the understanding of Asian elitism and how it has affected the Chinese American societies. Being of a mixed race or being of a mixed couple specifically has been detrimental to the Chinese society. This meant to the Chinese that the people who were born of mixed race, usually Chinese and American or Chinese and European, were not seen as Chinese enough or pure enough to be Asian. This way of thought has created a wedge between the Chinese in America and the Chinese of the Republic of China that prevented mixed race people from being accepted as Chinese. It has also created an unsettling feeling for the people who are mixed race and ethnicity. It causes people to not know who they identify with, what culture they can identify with, what practices they can practice without the fear of not being, in this case, Chinese enough. Author Emma Tang researched about the Eurasian experience and, again, the national identity and its explanation that the history and understanding of Asian elitism. The Eurasian experience truly showed how Asian elitism made people with mixed identities who were below full-blooded Chinese. If you are not fully Chinese, you are not seen as someone who's capable of carrying out the destiny of the Chinese in their society. National identity takes part as a significant role in Asian elitism because it has been known to create the divide. Tang writes, quote, "The Chinese concept of national identity helps us understand why international marriages, like Young's, becomes an issue of contention during the late periods of the 18th and 19th century into the early Republican era." End quote. Since the time of China's and the mixing of couples created a huge issue. The huge issue was that interracial mixing would lead to the bloodline that was not fully Chinese, meaning that a bloodline was not fully Chinese in the eye of Chinese was not seen as acceptable. What Tang wrote is explaining that a marriage between a European woman and a Chinese man, or a Chinese woman and a European man in the early 19th century was looked down upon. This created an issue that put into place Asian elitism in societal issues. It pertains to Asian elitism because the Chinese did not want the mixing of Chinese and any other race. The Chinese believed that interracial couples and marriages would create less national identity and taint the way the world sees the Chinese people. The Chinese wanted to only truly keep the Chinese successful and did not want anyone else to have a piece of this success. Tang also writes, quote, "The debates on Chinese Western intermarriages were thus not simply focused on race and blood purity, but were more fundamentally concerned with national identity and the fears of deracination that were magnified by the rising Western dominance of the era." End quote. National identity, again, has played a very significant role in Asian elitism. If a person who is Chinese does not have a strong national identity, it creates a problem that they are not seen as wanting to perform well for their country or having strong belief in their country. China sees the West as a threat, and other countries, which created a fear that led to Chinese only wanting pure Chinese to be successful and only reap the benefits of the Chinese success, and did not want mixing of any race at any time or kind. Now, the impacts on Asian elitism on Chinese overseas. What I have concluded from research and the impacts of Asian elitism and the migration of the overseas Chinese is Confucianism and its ideals created a separation of people due to social hierarchies and political hierarchies. Asian elitism is prevalent today due to Confucianism, racism, and elitist ideals. It has affected Chinese migration to the United States and caused a new identity and people group to emerge in the United States. Through the research done on Asian elitism, it has been exhibited and shown how detrimental elitism and Asian elitism has been to the Chinese society and to Chinese overseas. With the understanding of the term Asian elitism and how it affects the migration of Chinese and Chinese community in America, Asian elitism, which leads back to Chinese requests to keep racial purity and to identify the Chinese national identity. Chinese have immigrated to the United States to create their own lives, receive better chances, rather than enduring a continual divide of race, socioeconomic divide, and educational divide. Overseas Chinese that migrated to America looking for more opportunity are still experiencing Asian elitism in America. This is because they cannot live a normal life in China due to unfair circumstances of jobs, education, and the social divide, which proves Asian elitism is prevalent since China does not see people who do not fit into their high standards, socioeconomic expectation, race, or ethnicity. Throughout the research I have done, it has become very evident that social and political hierarchies have affected much of Eastern Asia, which has led to the research of what Asian elitism is and how it affects East Asia, specifically China. Asian elitism has been brought to the light in recent years and has begun to have been studied by historians. Throughout my research and findings, I have highlighted what Asian elitism is, what the community has affected, what the history of this type of elitism is, and what it has done to the overseas Chinese in America, proving that they have immigrated because of all of this. It has had its major effects on wealth, power, and societies between the Chinese and the overseas Chinese. Through the explanation and understanding of Confucian's impacts of Chinese hierarchies and the elitist attitude portrayed by Chinese towards overseas Chinese, Asian elitism in America has created niches, communities, expectations, and ways of life for the Chinese who have migrated to America. It is important to understand that this research is to highlight what ideals have been put into place to cause elitist ways of thought. To understand what has affected the overseas Chinese communities in America and the correlation of American elitism. This issue is so prevalent today, and this research has highlighted why it has become a problem and has explained the complex nature of how Asian elitism affects these communities, the ways of life, and their socio-economic background, education, and political understanding. This research has shown how Asian elitism affected the migration of Chinese in America and what that meant for Asian immigration. Overseas Chinese have dealt greatly with this type of elitism, and the research has shown the impact it has had on the community. With this new understanding of Asian elitism and its impact, it is important to continue this research for historians to highlight how big of an impact it has had on the Asian community and the many overseas Asians in America. Thank you for listening to my presentation.